Half the panelists you see here are at Indiana University, and half are, the other two are affiliates located elsewhere. Some affiliates are also attending the panel remotely through Zoom. I welcome them to see me. The themes of this panel relate to three different aspects of communication. Authenticity, which is associated with genuineness and truthfulness, can be considered to be a quality of the source itself, the social media content or the person who is producing that content. Believability, associated with notions such as credibility and trustworthiness, involves both the content and the perceptions and the ideology filter of the receivers, whereas deception, associated with notions such as duplicity, fraud, deviousness, guile, lying, and treachery, involves the intentions of those who create and distribute content that is inauthentic, but that may still be believable. We have a panel of experts here that I'd like to introduce briefly. Massimiliano Demata, behind me, is Associate Professor of English Linguistics at the University of Turin, Italy. He's published on the language of American and British politics, and particularly Donald Trump's language. He's currently researching nationalism and populism in social media and the language of left-wing populism in the context of Brexit. Alan Dennis is Professor of Information Systems at Indiana University, and he holds the John T. Chambers Chair of Internet Systems. He has studied social technologies for 30 years and fake news on social media for the last 2 years. Asta Zelenkowskaite is an Associate Professor of Communication at Drexel University. Among other topics, she studies Russian trolling, focusing on commenting behaviors in news portals and commenters' perceptions regarding whether the trolling is targeted or automated, which she links to international information warfare. And finally, Filippo Menser is a professor of informatics and computing at IU. His research spans web and data science, network science, and computational social science. His work on the spread of information and misinformation in social media has been covered in many US and international news sources. You should have a program, but just briefly, the structure of the panel will be that each panelist will present for approximately 8 minutes their own research. After that, there will be a debate among the panelists in response to questions posed by the moderator. And then finally, the audience will have the time to ask questions to the panelists. And we are requesting, if you have a Twitter account, that you tweet your questions to the hashtag that's given on the program, so that we can collect the questions in advance and choose the best one in the limited time that we'll have available for question and answers at the end. And then there will be brief closing remarks. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to our first presenter, who is Massimiliano Demata.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. I'd like to start my. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Okay. 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 I'd like to start my discussion of authenticity from, in fact, 2 articles which I found online just a few days ago. So it was a kind of a happy coincidence. The first one is by Associated Press and is about the Texas Senate election and Democrat candidate Beto O'Rourke. And O'Rourke, as you probably know, is fighting an uphill battle with Senator Ted Cruz, but is considering a very promising candidate. And the journalist of the Associated Press emphasizes the key quality, which is making O'Rourke particularly appealing in Democrat circles and beyond. In fact, for National Democrats, I quoted, it was the type of moment that epitomized a common buzzword in Democratic circles, authenticity, and the push to present candidates in a more open, unvarnished manner, offering a window to their values. So basically the authentic qualities or authenticity of O'Rourke are considered to be a very important asset. In fact, again, coincidentally, on the same day, I also read a piece in the New York Times about the voters' behavior and why they supported or did not support President Trump. And the two persons interviewed by the New York Times gave their thoughts on Trump. Mr. George Phillips, 25, a retired banker, said, "I am a supporter of Trump now. He may not always say things the way most presidents before him said them, but what does it matter? They didn't get the job done." On the other hand, Paul Wundell, physicist who reluctantly voted in 2016 for Hillary Clinton, said, "I just cannot believe what comes out of that guy's mouth every time he speaks. I feel like I'm on the playground as a second grader." I think that these two statements exemplify the differences in the evaluation of the political message and how and why Trump is perceived as more authentic by some. In fact, these differences, in fact, have to do, of course, with the different visions of the world and different social priorities of the democratic mind as opposed to the Republican mind. Of course, there's a lot of literature about it, including, of course, George Lakoff's work, but of course, I will not go into that now. I think the conservative, or rather, shall we call it, a non-liberal way of thinking is, in fact, is largely not based on facts, on logics, but it tends to be more based on emotions, whereby the Aristotelian pathos and not logos seem to come to the fore. And I think this is all part of an anti-rational and anti-logos move. Facts don't matter if they don't fit a certain worldview. And what really matters indeed is the impression of authenticity in who speaks and how he or she speaks, even more than what he or she says. I'm particularly intrigued by the fact, in fact, that we are in the middle of an election cycle in which authenticity has become an important part, or even the most important part, more than ever, at least, of the political conversation of the day, and one of the principles guiding political preferences. The authenticity of a candidate is considered as important as the issue discussed, or perhaps even more important than them. Or at least this is the kind of narrative that emerges that is emerging from news. I believe that we can somehow summarize today's paradigm of authenticity according to these three factors. So authenticity as a kind of evaluative principle in political life. Social media is one of the main conduits for authenticity for politicians, and indeed populism as an ideological framework based on authenticity and built on and communicated also, or even mainly, through social media. I see these three aspects as strictly related, in a way each of them feeding into the others. And to a great extent, the rise of authenticity in politics is a product of the rise of social media as an instrument, not just of propaganda, in fact, but of news. Social media, in fact, if and when they are used in a certain way, can communicate an aura of authenticity to those who speak through them. And of course, and that's because of the very nature of social media themselves. So, because of course, we are talking about social media in terms of a participatory culture based on, indeed, new forms of participation and collaboration, which indeed, and through this, of course, the internet has become an alternative source of media power in terms of the individual's empowerment and freedom. So the paradigm of social media is one in which we find interactive, many-to-many, user-generated, and allegedly transparent, and therefore, again, allegedly more authentic communication. Of course, to a great extent, this is an illusion, but at least it has the impression of being so. Of course, I'm not trying to offer a kind of deterministic idea of view of populism as created by social media, but social media and the simplification of social reality that comes with them have certainly been a powerful instrument for in the success of some populist leaders and movements in several parts of the world. I think a very interesting assessment of today's tendency towards authenticity comes, in fact, not from a linguist or from an expert in computer-mediated communication, but from Mark Thompson, who is actually the former Director General of the BBC and now is a Chief Officer of the New York Times Company. And he gives a definition of authenticism, which explains somehow authenticity in politics. Authenticism is the single-minded belief that all that really matters in public language is the supposed authenticity of a given speaker. The authenticist prizes the simplicity of language because he associates simple expressions with honesty of emotion and at least the appearance of being willing to engage with the lowliest member of the chosen community. So according to Thompson, authenticism surfaces every time that trust in politicians seem to be reaching a low, and the public is attracted not so much by the radical policies of an authenticist, but by how the radicalism of his or her policies constitutes a break from the status quo. So clearly, authenticism has a lot to do with the current definitions of populism, with its anti-establishment drive, and anti-establishment also means to be against the educated elite and science itself. In fact, populists claim to speak through the voice of the people and against the establishment. And in fact, we can say that the rise of authenticity, and indeed of authenticism, also coincides with the rise of populism itself. In fact, many populist leaders use a strong, often violent rhetoric against their opponents with a language which constitutes a break from the previous traditional political language. And indeed, this kind of language is seen as an indication of the fact that populist leaders are more sincere and more authentic. And in fact, populism has also been understood in terms of political style by Benjamin Moffat, who argued that the three main components of populist style are appeal to the people versus the elite, bad manners, and the crisis, breakdown, or threat. And of course, we see bad manners, especially in language, one of the most important ways in which authenticity is communicated. So we can find evidence of allegedly authentic language of course, in Donald Trump's tweets. In fact, his Twitter account is called @RealDonaldTrump, so emphasizing the fact that it is his real identity speaking through Twitter. And in fact, we do know that many of Trump's tweets are actually written by himself. I'd like to discuss very briefly, I don't know how long I still have, but...
Max, you're over time, actually.
Am I? Okay, all right. Okay, just summarizing in literally 1 minute. Okay. Very briefly, this is the, shall we call it, evidence of the way Trump uses his language in his Twitter account, and in a way, in particular in the last month of the 2016 presidential campaign, during the last month, in fact, of the electoral campaign. And this is how he uses hashtags. I cannot discuss now the results of my findings, but certain differences indeed in the style of Clinton and Trump are very evident, and indeed make a compelling argument for authenticity in political communication. Trump used personal attacks much more often than Hillary, for example, through the hashtag #CrookedHillary or drain the swamp metaphor, of course. And the Trump style tends to be more personal, more direct. He uses the first person singular pronoun much more often than Hillary herself. And in fact, he almost always speaks as if he's writing his own tweets. And in fact, he does do that. And in fact, he constructs through his tweets a very informal and personal narrative, unlike what happens with Hillary Clinton, who used indeed instead a very impersonal style. And in fact, it was not her voice which emerged directly from the tweets. And we can see how Hillary advertises events or quotes herself. So clearly, something which, in a way, places the reader of the tweets in a kind of a remote position from her. So Trump, in that sense, in terms of authenticity, is real, realistic, or presents himself as real, realistic, or believable. In fact, not because of his adherence to facts, but for some other principles, such as, of course, insults, a certain kind of language, which, of course, for many denote a lack of refinement, but can therefore be seen as authentic by many. And I think this also, as I said just at the beginning, authenticity in that sense seems to be an important factor in the narrative of today's politics. I don't think I can speak any more than this, so I'll probably...
Thank you very much. It's very interesting.